Professor David Abulafia, good morning to you, sir.
Oh, good morning. Yeah.
Thank you for attending. You are a historian, a professor emeritus of Mediterranean history at the University of Cambridge, Gonville and Caius College, author of seven books of history, especially interested in the Western Mediterranean world in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Amongst those books, there's the Western Mediterranean Kingdoms, 1200 until 1500, The Struggle for Domain, recently translated into Catalan in this La lluita pel domini de la Mediterrània, la gran expansió catalana de 1200 a 1500, with a slightly commercially adapted subtitle, let's say. Published by Bella's Events, good friends of this channel. David, let's get this first out of the way. When I started reading the book, I was reflecting on your surname, and I thought David must be descendant of Sephardic Jews. Then in the very book, there's Abraham Abulafia, which you put right behind Ramon Llull. Do you know exactly where your family came from?
Well, we know that the family, we know roughly when the family left Spain at the time of the expulsion of the Jews. We know that there were a lot of Abulafias in Spain with whom we do claim to be relations, right? So we have the direct line because, as is quite common among Sephardic Jews, we've preserved a lot of genealogical information. And so the Sephardim in Toledo in particular, we find a large number of Abulafias in Toledo, and we claim a connection with them. And in fact, if you go to Toledo nowadays, the Sinagoga del Transito was built by an Abulafia. So there's a real sort of connection there. As for Abraham Abulafia, it's not quite clear because he comes from Saragossa, and he also lives for a time in Tudela in Navarre. So what his connection is not entirely clear. But that's inevitable, that you can't always trace the connections. So it's an ancient family. Yes.
Yes. I thought maybe they're related or something would be very
well, probably in some way.
Yeah.
We call him at home, we call him Uncle Abraham. But exactly what happens, it's difficult to know because he did have children, we know that. But what happened to them, we don't know. And of course, he traveled a great deal. He spent time in Barcelona and then a lot of time in Sicily, but he went much further east. He went right across to the Middle East and so on. So it's difficult really to know where he is at any particular time.
Excellent. And how do you get interested in this Catalan world of centuries passed by and decide to get into it? And how alone were you when you were studying this subject in the English-speaking world? And how alone are you now? Has that changed?
Well, my interest in the Catalan world really emerged from my very first research project, which didn't involve the Catalans really. It was concerned with the history of the trade of the Kingdom of Sicily, particularly in the Norman and later periods, so 12th, 13th centuries. And I was studying particularly actually the Genoese and the Venetians, the Pisans. But I became more and more aware that there was, of course, a Catalan commercial presence also in Sicily. And so I became more and more interested in the possibility of tracing that. And that led me to collections of documents which had been published in, I suppose, must be the 1970s, 1980s, which were concerned with Catalan trade in Sicily in the 13th century. And they included quite a large number of documents which were preserved actually in Palermo concerning merchants. So I became more and more interested in that, and one of my interests being an attempt to sort of push people away from thinking of Mediterranean trade as all about spices and luxury goods, and to emphasize, as I do in this book, the importance of simply the movement of grain and other vital commodities. So one point I make in the book actually is how Mallorca became so heavily dependent on grain from Sicily and Sardinia. So that was pushing me more and more to an interest in the emergence of Barcelona as a center of trade. And I particularly began to focus, actually, partly through contact with a very distinguished historian of the Catalan world, Jocelyn Hilgarth, who was a professor in Canada, but he had a house in Mallorca and also a house in London, so I got to know him quite well. And the idea that one could perhaps take Ciutat de Mallorca as a very interesting case, where we can observe almost from the start the emergence of a commercial elite, a Catalan commercial elite. It's really fascinating to see it actually sort of springing up, coming into being in a way that we can't do for Genoa, which has much longer commercial history, that we can't, well, for Venice, sort of, but actually the documentation isn't so rich. So that took me deeper and deeper into the Catalan world, and I found myself attending these very stimulating congresses of the history of the Crown of Aragon, which take place every few years, either in Spanish territories or in Italy. It depends, sometimes in Sardinia, Sicily, whatever. And so made a lot of contact with Catalan scholars. And out of this came the idea of a book which would look at the Catalan world in its wider Western Mediterranean context, and particularly the interaction between the Catalan world and Italy. Because there's a sort of symbiosis that develops, obviously, with the Catalan acquisition of Sicily and Sardinia. But even before that, there's this competition. Charles of Anjou, this French prince who becomes king of Sicily, and his relationship, difficult relationship with the kings of Aragon, and so on. So there's a sort of sense that these were two rival sort of poles, two rival centers competing for control of the Western Mediterranean. And so that gave shape to the book. And that is why the book does include quite a lot of material also about the Kingdom of Sicily. So it's really a pairing of Catalan history and Southern Italian history.
Absolutely. I mean, what is fascinating, David, is the period, this period in the history of Italy, right? The Catalan reader would tend to focus on the House of Aragon for obvious reasons, but boy, it is interesting what's going on in Italy. The Guelphs and the Ghibellines, the Angevin French in the middle, the Catalans in Sicily, Naples and Sicily being pretty much the center of the Mediterranean world, and thus the Western world at that time, because it was very much Mediterranean centered. If you would have asked a Neapolitan or Sicilian at the time that they were, if you would have asked them what they were, probably the first answer they would have been, I'm a Christian, something like that, right? But after that, do you think that there was some sense of identity or belonging to the land, to the national ethnic group, let's say, to the swifting lordships that we see in that book, etc.? For instance, do you think that the resentment that there was in Sicily again towards foreign administrators would have been the same for the Provençal ones? than for the other Italian ones. Do you have do you think that there was this some sense of kinship already at the moment?
It's a very good question, and certainly the work that's been done on the history of Sicily in the 13th century has laid quite a lot of emphasis on the emergence of a sort of sense of Sicilian identity. And what's interesting about it is you have to remember that Sicily was effectively repopulated in the course of the 12th and 13th centuries with a very large migration of people from not just southern Italy, but even northern Italy, particularly the area around Genoa and Savona, Liguria. So you've got this transformation, also the religious identity of Sicily being transformed with the disappearance of Islam and a decline in the Greek Orthodox population. So the people who arrive, I think, brought with them some sort of sense from northern Italy, many of them, of a different sort of political culture in which the cities themselves, for instance, might become self-governing units. They tried during the Great Revolt of the Sicilian Vespers in 1282 to develop this idea. They appealed to the Pope for support, but the Pope was on the other side. He wasn't going to support this. But the idea of developing that sort of urban political culture, which never really did develop in Sicily and southern Italy. So there's a sort of sense that they were, yes, they were rebelling as Sicilians. On the mainland, the other part of the kingdom of Sicily, it's a bit quieter. They don't seem so engaged with these issues. It's quite interesting that there's that contrast, and it partly reflects the fact that the kings of Sicily were paying much more attention to the mainland. They were based in Naples and other cities on the mainland, and some of their economic policies seemed to benefit the mainland more than the island of Sicily. King Charles, this French prince, he hardly ever visited Sicily. So there's a sort of sense that Sicily had been abandoned, having been the great center, really the command center of the kingdom. It had now lost that role. And then on the Catalan side, very important, of course, also the development of a sense, but in a rather different way, a sense of distinctive identity, which we see in the Catalan Chronicles. And that sort of pride in being a Catalan. So however it was defined. I mean, was it defined by being a Catalan Christian? Well, possibly not, because as I show in the book, there was also a significant Jewish population. There were rather fewer Muslims in Catalonia than in other parts of what became the Crown of Aragon. But that sort of sense of a distinctive identity, the use of the Catalan language, those chronicles, it's really very interesting, very exciting to see. We have, after all, the autobiography of King James I from the 13th century, which is the earliest such work, and it's written in the vernacular. So something is also happening there. And then when you read Muntaner in this early 14th century chronicler who writes at great length about the Catalan company in Greece and so on, I get a very strong sense of a sort of Catalan identity. And historians, having been, I think, rather skeptical about the idea of national identity in the late Middle Ages, I think they've shifted quite significantly on that. Also looking at other parts of Europe, in England, for instance, much more awareness of a gradually developing idea of a distinctive identity. In the case of England, distinctive identity vis-à-vis France in particular. And these conflicts very often accentuated that as well. So conflicts between Castile and Aragon, Catalonia, conflicts between, again, England and France.
Well, I'm glad that this has changed because I think it wasn't quite tenable. Listen, we have spoken about Naples, about Sicily. There has been recently in Catalonia interest in traces of Catalan rule and cultural influence uh, of the Catalan language in Malta, especially in the colors of local coats of arms, associations, and in Catalan words within the Maltese language, which is a Semitic language, but has a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
vocabulary that it's
Yeah.
Catalan. Has is the international historian community aware of that? Because there seems to be no no awareness of that. Some people just discovered that and started looking at the similarities, and we don't find that in any history book yet. Uh, were you aware of that? Do you think that this is something that people is aware of?
I wasn't aware of it. I do have some contact with historians in Malta. I mean, obviously, they're a small group and they do publish quite a lot of work. So I obviously need to find out more about it. It doesn't come as a surprise, though, because Malta in this period was part of the Kingdom of Sicily. And particularly, I mean, in the 15th century, King Alfonso the Magnanimous, Alfonso the Fourth in Catalonia, Alfonso the Fifth in Aragon, he took a strong interest in Malta. So one might expect that sort of thing. That the aristocracy, the nobility in Malta, they actually tended to be Italian speaking in this period. The Maltese language was more of a sort of patois uh, spoken by the rural population, of course. But it's not surprising that they would pick up this sort of terminology. This question of the spread of Catalan culture, of course, there's one very interesting example, some distance from Malta, and that is Alghero, l'Alger in Sardinia. And you still encounter people there who speak Catalan. I remember being there a few years ago. My taxi driver, I had a conversation with him. Yes, he spoke Catalan. So that's sort of the way in which Catalan culture could implant itself, in that case, on a really rather massive scale with a significant immigration of Catalan population, is extremely interesting.
All right, I'll be sending you some details on that.
Yes, do that. Yes, I'd be interested. Yes.
Right. So, in the introduction of the book, you say that there's more historians in the English-speaking world that take into account the Catalan sources. Um, why didn't that happen before, and what has changed? Also, it has been a while since the first edition. Has that changed at all, or are those well, available, well known? Is there anything that can be done?
So you're talking about the presence of all these.
The sources, so that
Yes.
any historian that would be looking at the period
Mm.
would take in account the archives of the Crown of Aragon, for instance, and things like that, which traditionally they were very controlled by the narrative was very controlled by the Spanish state, so it would have a particular lens. But now that the sources are available, are they being used international, are well known, etc.?
Yeah. Um, yes, I mean, obviously, one of the challenges when it comes to writing the history of Catalonia in this period is the vast scale of the archive of the Crown of Aragon. And I've been taken behind the scenes in the archive. And when you see multiple copies of the documents, King James II, um, and the scale is astonishing. I mean, it really is one of the very great archives of Europe. Now we also have the archive of Catalonia in Barcelona. And this has turned out to be very interesting because an important discovery, which was found among, believe it or not, the archives of the Jesuits deposited in this bigger the Jesuits, who didn't even come into existence till after the end of the medieval period. but within that, an extraordinary repository of documents concerning a commercial firm based in Saragossa and Barcelona, the Torralba, in the 15th century. And I think if I were to single out a particular group of documents that have the potential to transform our understanding of the Mediterranean in that period, it would be the Torralba documents. And one reason is that, coming back to something I said earlier, we have to remember that trade within the Mediterranean also involved much humbler commodities such as grain. And here is a company that was very interested in that sort of product and so on. So there's a group in Barcelona which is working very hard to publish the documentation, to publish material about the documentation. And I think that is one of the significant, really significant developments taking place at the moment. Okay. But there's always the possibility of more and more material being discovered, of course, given that when we're talking about the lands of the Crown of Aragon, we're talking about such an enormous geographical space. So more material turning up. If I think particularly again of the 15th century in southern Italy, the documentation concerning the Kingdom of Naples. Now, a lot of it was destroyed during the Second World War, but actually further north in Milan, and I was working on some of that material when I was working on this book, actually. So it has it's people have been looking at it for several years now, but the diplomatic correspondence of the kings of Aragon, the Aragonese kings of Naples, so Alfonso and then his son Ferrante or Ferdinand, with the dukes of Milan. It's an extraordinary body of material. And again, people in Naples have started to publish a lot of this material. But even then, it's only a fragment of a great mountain of documentation. So there's always more out there. That's part of the excitement, but also the frustration, because you're always feeling, well, how am I ever going to get on top of this material? There's just so much of it.
Well, it's always exciting. That's one of the things that, David, another thing that surprised me is the Anjou dynasty, totally committed to Italy and Naples. Also, his house was full of men of the Provence.
Yes, yeah.
Which was quite surprising to me. In our head, we equate Anjou with the French, the Languedoc, right? But you avoid calling it French. You call it Angevin. How was really this dynasty? Was it more Italian than French already, or more Provençal than Franchiman? Because they seem to be totally committed to Italy and Naples and later Jerusalem. Everybody wants to go to Jerusalem, apparently, apart from the Catalans. But how
well, even Alfonso in the 15th century, yes, he talked about crusade.
Yeah, but less committed. How was this Anjou dynasty?
Yes, the Provence, the role of Provence is actually very important, because one has to remember that the counts of Provence in the 12th century had been Catalan. And the loss of Provence to the House of Anjou is, to my mind, one of the issues that created this, I'm going to use the word vendetta, perhaps that's too strong a word, between the House of Anjou and the House of Aragon. That again and again, the Angevins were capturing territory to which the Aragonese had some sort of claim. I mean, Sicily is another example because of the claim through Constance of Hohenstaufen, the wife of King Peter of Aragon. So Provence was already, at the very beginning of my story, it was already an area of contention. And it remained a very important issue for the Angevin kings, because of its proximity to Italy. But this takes me to the question of how to describe it, not as part of France. Politically, at this period, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, linked historically to the now defunct Kingdom of Burgundy, but it only became part of France and the ages of Charles VIII and Louis XII and so on, integrating it into France. You've got this situation where the Angevins had these two power bases, one in Naples and one in Provence. And in Provence, that created a bridge into Piedmont, into the northwest of Italy, and deeper into Italy, because they were trying to build up their power vis-a-vis the Genoese, a very ambiguous relationship always with Genoa, which of course saw itself as a great power in its own right. And then potentially beyond that as well, deeper into the Lombard plain. So one shouldn't underestimate the political, strategic importance. Nowadays, we would say, I suppose, geopolitical importance of Provence. In the years around 1300, spent most of his reign in Provence. Robert of Anjou spent a lot of time in Provence. And Provence was also, we have to remember, the base for the papacy during a significant part of the 14th century, which was one of the reasons Robert of Naples was there, with this rather strange political arrangement by which the papacy had a sort of enclave within Provence, but it's a very close relationship was built up between the Angevins and several of the popes. And in some ways, and we always talk about popes of Avignon being under a sort of French shadow, but in some respects, they were under a Neapolitan shadow because of that intimate relationship in Provence. And then when you get into the 15th century, you've got this extraordinary figure, René of Anjou, who only very briefly managed to capture Naples, but was the great rival of Alfonso the Magnanimous. And for him, Provence, which remained in his hands, was one of his really major political bases, though he also had territory in Anjou and all over the place, actually. And he tried to invade Catalonia, of course, as well, but failed in his attempt. So it's always there as a very significant element in the picture. And I think also another factor one might want to mention is that the Provençal language, what we now call Occitan, was very closely related to Catalan. So we find, for instance, James I in his autobiography, sometimes he'll say something, he'll quote something that he himself had said, and it will be in what is clearly Occitan, so much closer to the language of Provence rather than Catalan, depending on where he is. If he's in Montpellier, he's in Languedoc, he's speaking obviously in Occitan. So there was a sort of cultural symbiosis as well. The influence of, you think of the Provençal troubadours and people like that.
Yeah, I encourage our Catalan readers to look into the Angevin part of this book because it's a fascinating dynasty and state. David, I was surprised and satisfied reading your book on the chapter in which you explain how Majorca became the trade hub or an emporium of the Mediterranean, with branches all the way to Flanders in England under James II. And you have a book specifically about that. Are you aware of a migration that occurred allegedly from Spain to England during the time of the Spanish Inquisition, that some people say that they brought the kind of commercial company that was in the Mediterranean from the Catalan world into England? So this kind of Bilalba kind of companies into England. Uh, there's recent documentation about that. I don't know if you are aware of that.
No, I haven't come across that, but the relationship between Mallorca and England is certainly a very interesting question. And at one of these congresses of the history of the Crown of Aragon, many years ago, my contribution was um, a paper about the relationship between Mallorca and England in the late 13th, beginning of the 14th centuries, because there are quite a lot of documents actually in the English archives that speak about this. And there was an article by a very famous Genoese historian, Roberto Lopez, which had made some rather big claims about whether the Genoese or the Mallorcans got to England first by sailing through the Strait of Gibraltar. It's sort of an old question about when Strait of Gibraltar was made open to shipping, to commercial shipping in this period. I found quite a lot of documents that Lopez hadn't looked at. What one finds is that the Mallorcans, they do seem to have been sort of innovators, entrepreneurs alongside the Genoese, going all the way to London, going to Flanders and so on, bringing wool from London into the Mediterranean, and it would eventually end up, a lot of it, in Florence, actually, where it would be woven into very fine cloth, because English wool was of such high quality. So there are these links, but the Genoese in the longer term are much more successful in establishing a commercial base in London. Catalan, certainly a Catalan presence, but it faded away. It sort of came and went, actually. To some extent, also, it was involved in, not so much with Mallorca, but other Catalans, for instance, from Valencia, carrying dried fruit and sugar and ceramics, these wonderful ceramics from Valencia, being carried through the Strait of Gibraltar all the way to England. So there was quite a lot of contact at that level.
Right. Actually, I think that what I was mentioning is more like in the reign of Elizabeth I.
Yeah, I think probably yes, in which in which the relationship between England and Spain, of course, it goes up and down all the time, depending on whether King Philip
I don't
is
know. There's some allegedly
friendly or unfriendly. Yeah.
some Protestant Catalans flew to England and and started their businesses in England's green and pleasant land. Um, there's a phrase that a phrase that you say which occurs with basically there's a moment in which you say both the English and the Catalan found themselves with an empire they were not looking for. They were just they were just protecting commercial interests, and they find themselves with it's a well-known phrase about the British Empire, but I think that you'll find something similar, a similar way of behaving. Even within Catalan national circles, there's this idea, this some sort of torch being passed from the Catalan world to the English and from the English to the Americans. But following those commercial interests, there is one that I found fascinating, which is the North African,
Mm.
enclaves that we find. What do we know about that? Because you mentioned there's some disputed consulates, and even there's like sometimes competing the Barcelona consulate with the Majorca ones, and as well with the Italians. How do we approach that? Do we have documentation of that? What do we know about those things? Because I
Well,
find them like
yeah, there's
amazing.
quite a lot of correspondence because, well, partly because of these conflicts. And a Catalan scholar Antonio Riera Meli, he wrote a very helpful book about this, including, I have to say, the documents, which was useful. And this sort of conflict between the kings of Aragon, counts of Barcelona on the one hand, and the kings of Mallorca, which was going on all the time at the beginning of the 14th century over the relationship, whether the king of Mallorca was subordinate to Aragon or, well, was he subordinate to King of Aragon or to the Count of Barcelona? That's an interesting question. Maybe the same person, but two different political entities. And the question of the consulates along the coast of North Africa, this was something in these towns like Bougie and so on. This was something which became a live issue because the Catalans were constantly insisting that the Mallorcans had no right to establish their own consulates, but the Mallorcans were also negotiating directly with the emirs who ruled these towns on the coast of North Africa. So you've got this very difficult situation, which is not just about commercial competition, also about the political relationship between the kings of Aragon, counts of Barcelona, and on the other hand, the kings of Mallorca. So what do we know about the settlements themselves? I think the best way one can probably describe them, unfortunately, really, is by looking at their rivals, because we have so much more documentation about, if you're talking about the actual physical layout of these fonduks, as they were called, which is originally a Greek term, but it's come through Arabic into the Romance languages. And we know quite a lot about the Genoese, for instance, in Tunis. And this was a large area in which they even had their own wine store and thing. They were allowed to do that by the rulers, who were very disapproving of the consumption of alcohol, but nonetheless, it was all part of the deal with the Genoese. And it had a very full life. I mean, you read about prostitutes and people like that. It wasn't just a group of merchants. And some recent research, very good research, which has been done not specifically on North Africa, but on the Kingdom of Granada in the same period, where in Malaga, they've managed to excavate the foundations of the Genoese Castile, as it's called. There was a whole fortified area in which the Genoese operated in Malaga. And there was also a significant Catalan and Mallorcan presence in Malaga. So, one has to use probably those places as the Genoese settlements as a sort of model, but thinking of them as probably rather larger, certainly larger than anything the Mallorcans could establish. But the Catalan presence was, in some of these places, very significant in all sorts of ways, not just a large mercantile community, but also mercenaries. One has to remember that Catalan soldiers fighting on behalf of these Muslim rulers, sometimes actually against Christians. That was one of the things that happened. And then there's another element which needs to be brought into the picture, and this again brings in Mallorca, and that is the presence of Jewish merchants. Now, the Jewish merchants, did they actually live in these mercantile settlements? I don't think so. They lived among the Jewish communities in these cities, with whom they often had close family relationships. And some of them were able to penetrate much deeper into the Sahara than the Christians ever could. And they had the advantage that the use of Arabic was still quite widespread among the Jews of Iberia. So that's another element in the picture, which is very important.
That would explain the best maps were done by Jews in Mallorca. And it's very poignant when you say the mercenaries. I think that even some of these emirs had like your personal god, the Almogador, and things like that.
Yes.
Would have made some sort of protectorate or something like that. Yeah, it's
no, it's extraordinary, and it went the other way as well. Actually, Muslim for Emperor Frederick II, ruler of Sicily, for some of the kings of Aragon, and so on. It's fascinating that in the age of the Crusades, you had these people who were being hired to fight by the other side.
Maybe they took religion more chicken tongue than we do. David, I think that the selling of the Catalan of this Catalan version of your book is being very successful. If you were to translate or to have some of a book translated, would that be a Mediterranean Emporium, the Catalan Kingdom of Majorca, or being from 1994 would be maybe surpassed by a newer like the Boundless Sea? Which one would you like to see translated?
I think with the Mediterranean Emporium, it was translated into Castilian, and um, the feeling there at the time, because I did say, do you want it to be translated into Castilian or Catalan? And the feeling was that one needed to reach a wider audience across Spain, because people in Castile and Navarre and so on, they know nothing about really the history of Catalonia, Aragon. So there's always this question. I mean, it's not for me to engage with it, but so this particular book, the new book, I mean, it has appeared in Castilian as well, but it's really very gratifying that it sold out. The first edition sold out very quickly. We've already got the second edition. It's quite extraordinary, and really tremendous news. And I'm also extremely happy to have one of my works translated into Catalan. I've had one or two articles translated into Catalan. Like, for instance, this article about the Majorcan merchants going to England. That was actually published, first of all, in Catalan, and then it became a chapter in my book about Mallorca. As for the book on Mallorca, anyway, there's been quite a lot of research in recent years, and particularly the sort of tail end of the period I deal with there. So much more new documentation. A very important source of documents has been an archive in Prato, just outside Florence. The famous Tuscan merchant Francesco d'Attini, who around 1400 was carrying on business on a massive scale in places like Mallorca, Minorca, and the Catalan world, and also North Africa and so on. And a lot of new research has been done there. So I think it would involve quite a lot of rewriting in a way that a more general book like this one, I think, doesn't. I'm not sure. I'm not saying. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot published since the Western Mediterranean kingdoms came out. And of course, one of the things I was trying to do in the Western Mediterranean kingdoms, which may look a little bit strange in the Catalan edition, is to represent the enormous amount of research which had been done by British and American historians, and some French historians as well, by people writing outside Catalonia or Italy, because at the time there were so many of them. Now that has changed. There was a generation which was led by some really very eminent, particularly American historians. There was a man called Robert Burns, Father Burns, a Jesuit, who wrote an enormous amount about the conquest and settlement of Valencia, for instance. There was the man I mentioned earlier, Jocelyn Hillgarth, who wrote very significant works, not just on Mallorca, but on wider issues to do with the history of Iberia. And there's a whole catalogue of people. And that generation has now largely disappeared. And they were always very good sort of patrons to me. They helped me a great deal with advice and so on, at a time when they were already very senior scholars. So there's much less, certainly in the United Kingdom, very few people working on the history of the Catalan world in this period. And in the United States, there's been a shift again away from the history of Iberia generally, which became very fashionable in the United States, I think, because of the large growth of the Hispanic population, who were people who were interested in not necessarily their own personal roots, but the sort of Spanish connections that could be drawn out. So, yeah.
Yes, pretty much. As a primary thing, everybody's pretty much interested in their own sphere. For instance, I think that this period is quite fascinating, the one that you described in this film. And it is underrepresented. For instance, in popular historical circle or historical broadcasts, like there's a English podcast called The Rest is History with Tom Holland.
Yes.
They've never talked about anything like that, which is something
No,
surprising. Like
no, no.
This is like a fascinating history, and they don't even mention it once. No, it's I think they were when you had your book translated into Spanish. I think that if you would have had it translated into Catalan, maybe you would have had a big, more bigger response because of course people here would be very, very much interested, especially the Majorcan, right? But anyway, it is a fascinating period. I hope we get some other translation into Catalan from some of your work. We need to
Oh, be nice.
we need to pressure somebody in Bella's events for that to happen. I'm ever so glad you you accepted this interview. Is there anything else that you would like to say, or is there anything that you're working on that it would be interesting for us?
Well, the sort of work I've been doing lately hasn't really involved the Western Mediterranean so much. I've actually been writing quite a lot about the Black Sea, and you don't find many Catalan merchants in the Black Sea.
You haven't searched,
Yeah, well, there were one or two. No, they do appear, but they're minority. No, reflecting on what you just said, it is so striking that figures who are dominating figures in the history of the Catalan world, I think always of Alfonso the Magnanimous in the 15th century. Nobody's heard of him in this country, and yet he bestrides the whole Mediterranean. He's a figure of enormous importance, a sort of Napoleon of his time, and I'm always struck by that and how reputations are made, are created by, you could say, the sort of history industry, as it were, and sometimes that needs to be challenged. Yes.
I think that in the continent, the history industry, you would say, follows very much the state narratives. But in the Anglo-Saxon world and the English-speaking world, it's more like scholar to scholar. So I think that if interest picks up, it could be as well because the history itself of this period is amazing. I mean, I was reading all this Angevin stuff. Amazing, even if it's not my history, right? It's just a fascinating document. Well, thank you very much, David,
Well, thank you. Yeah.
for the interview, and I'll let you know when it comes out, and
Yep.
I'll send you these couple of references. Thank you very much.
Excellent. No, I'd be grateful for the references. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good to talk. Bye.
Bye bye.